Hi, my name's Lindsay McClellan, and I'm one of Lindsay Vest's former teachers. And Lindsay asked me to show you how I make kombucha, since she knows that I do that a lot. So bear with me. I don't have any fancy recording equipment, but I'm going to give you some of the basics. So this is a batch of kombucha that I've already made. I just use a big old pickle jar to make that. And it's important that when you're making kombucha, you let it breathe, or else the fermentation process will explode your jar. So, piece of cheesecloth, I use those little footy socks that let it breathe. But the interesting thing about kombucha, and some of the things that maybe people don't really realize, is that the bacteria creates something that we call a SCOBY, SCOBY. And here, let me turn it. This is what it looks like. Actually looks kind of gross. But the SCOBY stands for Symbiotic Colony of Bacteria and Yeast. And that is what is fermenting the drink. Now, your SCOBY over time, with every new batch that you make, makes new layers. So in this batch of SCOBY, or in this batch of kombucha, I actually have 3 SCOBYs. And the cool part about that is I'm going to make a little jar to share with 2 other friends so that they can start making their own kombucha. So whenever you're going to share with your friends, here, I'm going to put it down here so you can kind of see how this process works. You give them a SCOBY in a jar, and you give them about a cup of your batch of kombucha to get it started. And so I'm going to give each one of my friends some of my kombucha. Now, with this process here, I have to be careful. You never want to screw the lid on too tight, because like I was mentioning before, your kombucha, when you're fermenting, it will explode your jar if it gets too much pressure buildup, and that's just the gases released from the fermentation process. So for me, at this point, my family doesn't really like the taste of kombucha when it's plain, and so we make our second ferment, which is the flavoring ferment. I gotta put this for my next batch. Hang on one second. And so what I do with that jar is I just get some frozen fruit. You can flavor it with just about anything, but we really like the mixed berry blend. And I load up the jar of kombucha with some mixed berries. Let's go ahead and top that off. And I let that sit now for another day, and I will put a cap on there for the flavoring part because I want it to get a little fizzy. And so this kombucha that used to be pretty clear, in a short amount of time will be really dark and you won't be able to see through it. So I'll cap that in a little bit. But I wanted to show you how to make the next batch of kombucha. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take a new jar. You are going to, I've been brewing some tea here. And so I take this batch of tea. It's still pretty hot. And I squeeze out the remainder of the water. Go back to your room, please. Right now, I'm using green tea. When you're getting started, it's easiest to use black tea because green tea, it's a little more finicky. I like the taste of it better, but it's more likely to have an issue with mold. So, very important thing to note here, when you're making it, you have to use either organic black tea or organic green tea, because if you don't use organic, you're just concentrating pesticides into your drink, and that's definitely not a good thing. So your kombucha has to be room temperature, but like I was just mentioning, this is still very hot because I just boiled the tea, and so I cannot use that the way it is because it'll kill the SCOBY colony. And so I need to make sure that I get it back down to room temperature. So I've got a little bit of tea. I used 8 tea bags. And then we're going to add a cup of sugar, real white sugar. And the sugar is what feeds the SCOBY. It's what feeds the bacteria in your kombucha, and so you have to have sugar. It's not something that you can substitute with honey. It needs to be plain old white sugar. And then from here, I'll just keep adding cold water to my jar. And I did 4 cups before, so I'm going to do a little bit more. Just making a huge mess here. Gives me 8 cups. So this batch is to make a 3-quart, or I'm going to actually probably do a gallon. And by adding that cold water to it, it's making this tea that I had made before room temperature, so I don't have to wait for it to cool down. The first time I started doing this, it made a mistake of boiling the whole gallon of water when I was making tea, and then it just takes a really long time for a gallon of water to cool down. So now I've got my tea ready, and I just give that quick stir to mix that sugar up nice and well into the water. And then I'll add the SCOBY back to it. And your SCOBY, sometimes it sinks, sometimes it comes to the top, sometimes it hangs out somewhere in the middle. That doesn't really matter. But when you're making kombucha, it will look like there is mold forming on the top of it. Most often it's not mold, it's actually a new SCOBY, because every time you make a batch of kombucha, it makes its own new SCOBY, and it'll form a new layer on the top of your jar there. So that's all there is to making kombucha. And like I said, you want to make sure that you do not use a cap, that you use something nice and easy to keep it on there, but let it breathe. So yeah, that's the basics on making kombucha. I'll show you real quick the recipe that I use. And it talks about how much you should use to drink. Where is my camera? Okay, sorry, I have it flipped the wrong way. I don't even know if that's going to show you the right way. It's not, so let me just tell you. 3 quarts of water, 1 cup of sugar, 4 organic black tea bags. And then for me, I usually double that. So I do 8 green tea bags and the little starter from the previous batch. So hopefully that helps.